Hello, it's Henry here, and welcome to the second episode of the Northern Roses podcast. This episode on what left and right politics mean was first recorded in July 2024, so there may be some topical bits which sound a little out of date, but the theory discussed here is still relevant. The episode is more academic than the last, and acts as an introduction to political philosophy, which we hope you find interesting. Thank you for listening, and if you want to support the podcast, you can subscribe to our emails and recommend the pod to your friends. I hope you enjoyed the new intro music. It maybe needs a bit of fine tuning, but there we go. And welcome back to another episode of Pub Politics. And this week the pub politicians are talking about left and right in politics, and what these terms mean and how they relate to you. We've all heard the political commentators saying things like, Labour aren't even a left party anymore. They're centrist. But what, the Lib Dems are centrist too? So what does it all mean? Well, to talk through it, I've got myself, Henry North, a freelance journalist from Manchester, and my brother Adam, who is looking to finish his PhD from the University of Manchester in September. One important thing to define before this podcast starts is the state, and we're going to define it as the government, civil service, the police, the king, anyone who is paid by taxpayer money. So we wanted to focus this episode on what it actually means to be left and right of politics, because we hear these terms thrown around a lot, and a lot of us might not actually necessarily know what it means or what people mean when they say Labour aren't even left anymore. What does that mean? We're going to try and really unpick the theory behind it all, and then maybe in the last half of this podcast we're going to try and pick some practical examples. We'll get more into it later, but for now we'll just start with the theory. So those of you who aren't familiar with left and right, I think the easiest way to visualise it, and it's not perfect, is to imagine drawing a horizontal line, basically the west to east line of a compass, and then replace each direction with left and right. And on this line you can place a political idea, and that's kind of what we're going to do today. Have I explained that well?
Yeah, but I think it's important to say that what's left or right depends on the person who uses the word, because just like some people will argue, as Suella Braverman argued that Robert Jenrick was left, which we'll explain more.
Who's Suella Braverman?
These are Conservative MPs arguing about where each other sit in the political landscape, whereas most people would argue that they're both on the right. She would argue that other Tories are on the left because they're left of her. And so a lot of it does depend on where you sit, just as many people will say that they're in the centre, that they're in many ways, they'll say, I'm a centrist, or I sit in the middle. What they really mean by that is everyone who differs from me is too far to one side. And so a lot of it depends on where you sit in the political spectrum. But we're going to try and look at it as, well, what's the ideology that leads one to being described as on the left, or what's the ideology that leads one to being described on the right? And these are the key fundamental underpinnings from which we say someone moves in a different direction.
Yeah, so I'd say, having studied politics at uni, we're probably going to have a look at it from a more, classical take, maybe. So where would we like to start?
Well, the state is run through taxes, and it's a centralised form of organisation. It is supposed to be the voice of the people, through which it looks after us, it protects us, it sorts out through bureaucracy and through institutions all the things we need to survive. So in theory it manages the water, the sewage, healthcare, education, all of these things that we need are managed by the state.
And the key point of debate is how people interact with the state.
Yeah, so if you're on the left, normally you want the state to interact more in your life. And if you're on the right, you want the state to interact far less. And a lot of people might instinctively want the state to meddle less in their lives. But I think when we see all the things the state does for us and how much we rely on it, then it starts to look a little bit different.
Okay, so with that in mind, could you explain to me what it means to be a leftist, but a middle ground leftist?
Yeah, again, it depends where you sit, doesn't it? Because, You know, are you talking about the furthest left being like a full-on Marxist communist, or are you saying the furthest left is like just state socialism? It's a difficult place, but let's say, yeah, just from how people in general talk about it, the centre left kind of argues for a welfare system, reasonably high taxation. So, for example, Scandinavia is often considered like these sort of socialist hubs, socialist ideal societies where it's high tax, good welfare systems, good public transport, healthcare, education all work really well. And people don't tend to see the state as antagonistic. They don't see it as their enemy. They see it as something that paying your taxes is actually a public good, and you are basically all contributing towards the same shared goal.
So when we're looking at things like the prison crisis now, the idea is that maybe we perhaps pay a bit more tax, but then the prisons would be looked after a lot better.
Well, prisons is an interesting one because not only, let's take Scandinavia again, which is often used as kind of the great example of a good socialist state, or us good socialist states, because they have prison systems that seem to work much better. Because in theory, what is a prison meant to be? It's supposed to take away your freedom, but not your dignity. Whereas what's happened in our society and America as well is that prisons take away your freedom and your dignity. Because what they do is they basically put you in a place of squalor and violence and then say, now rehabilitate. There is no actual attempt to rehabilitate you. It's just really punitive punishment. Whereas in Scandinavia, it's actually about rehabilitation. It's a recognition from the state that you have experienced difficulties in your life that have led you to crime, and now let's rehabilitate you. And that's kind of the system that Labour propose now, is a rehabilitative process through which the state gives you the tools to re-enter society.
So we're not just talking about prisons here, though, but when we talk about things like healthcare, people might just think about a hospital. But in reality, the healthcare that the state can provide is much deeper than that. It goes much further. So when you think about things like how mentally ill children are looked after, if they've got a parent who has to work and there's no one there to look after the child, the state can then step in, can't they? And I think there are a lot of stories coming out at the moment of how lacking that has been. So when you talk about really our most vulnerable people, like the disabled people, when there isn't a welfare state there to look after these people, they're just cast aside, really.
Well, councils' biggest expenditure, and this is why a lot of councils are going bankrupt, their biggest expenditure is adult social care. Because we all know that as people get older, if they no longer have the money to look after themselves, they need people to help them. And so adult social care is one of the biggest spends that local councils have to pay for. The idea is that really you need these people to be protected, or what, do we just let them all die? You know, that's or they have to sell their houses and become homeless. So adult social care is a huge cost, and this is, it's related to healthcare and a number of factors as well, because these, as the left ideology is it's all interconnected, and it's all holistic in that all of these systems work with one another. Just like the idea that, say, bans on sugar helps in a number of different sectors, and just how increasing education helps across a range of different parts of society.
So, to put you on the spot here, if you had to have a sentence which really describes leftist ideology, what would it be?
Oh, there was a good one I saw the other day, but it's to your needs you receive, because I think that's the case. The deep ideological point of the left is that we don't need more than we need. Nobody needs this kind of excessive wealth, and if we all had shared collective,
Well, I mean, I think you can just on that point, you can look at things like food and the amount of food waste there is, and if people didn't have more, or there wasn't more food production to people that didn't need it, I mean, that's just one instance of how a big problem could be solved quite efficiently. And when people think about left, they do inevitably think about the C word, communism. And that really is the most extreme version of leftist ideology, isn't it?
Yeah, so communism is that all assets are controlled by communes. who allocate resources out through some kind of centralised government. But I don't think many people on the left, at least in the Western world, are pushing for that kind of allocation of resources. They just want greater levels of taxation on the ultra wealthy so that the state can provide for those with nothing.
Yeah, and
Yeah, they're not
vulnerable
saying
children can have places to live.
what they're not saying what most of the left aren't saying is let's seize every rich person's assets and distribute them out to everyone else, or distribute them out among the population so that everyone has the same amount. I don't think there are, of course, some people who suggest that, but it's not. I mean, we've seen historically in the past this kind of purge of the I guess, to use Marxist terminology, of the bourgeois, of the upper middle class or the elites, doesn't end well.
Yeah. So if we have that compass line again, and you've got the left, communism would be that furthest point on the line. So with that in mind, we can then have a word about the right of politics and what does it actually mean to be on the right.
Yeah, well, the right is interesting because, I mean, we didn't touch really there actually on the freedoms, but we'll talk about it now when we get to the right. But the right pushes for basically super low taxation and minimal interaction with the state. The state for them shouldn't really have to, just as the minimal, shouldn't really have to do much else. And in fact, most of the spending should be on law and order, because a lot of people on the right really suggest that through your own, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. You can, through your own hard work, do everything that you need to do.
Which can be quite appealing, really, when you think that, I'm responsible, I'm the master of my own fate, I don't need anyone interfering in my business, I can look after myself, and I can go out there and I can be the person that I want to be.
It absolutely draws people in because that ideology is a nice one to have. And for some people it's possible. For some people you're in the position through which your own hard work and ingenuity can reap huge rewards. And so of course that appeals. But the problem is that for a vast number of people, that isn't available to them. And those doors are closing at an even greater pace. Because, say, for example, if I wanted to become a billionaire now, that would be impossible. Like the kind of wealth that some of the people in this country have, that is not even, you can't even attempt to reach that. Maybe, for some people, an achievable goal could be becoming a millionaire. That's maybe achievable, but achieving the wealth of some of the 0.1% in this country, no one can achieve that unless you inherit it.
And when you hear people bang around a term like libertarianism, is this what they mean?
Well, libertarianism is the idea that markets should be entirely free, because free markets always have the best allocation of resources and they're able to, basically the market meets the demands and that it works itself out. It is this idea of fatalism in a way, which is why it is often linked to sort of Christian religion and ideology. Is this idea that fate will work itself out and all that government does is prevent the market from reaching efficiencies. But what actually happens in reality is that actors in the market don't act in good faith and they don't act fairly. In fact, they often cheat. And what happens is when there's no regulation and there's no government intervention or no regulatory apparatus, the markets do not act freely. And in fact, they establish monopolies and they establish anti-competitive behaviour.
So when you say monopoly, can you just define what that is?
Yeah, so there's a natural monopoly and a monopoly among the free market. A natural monopoly is things like water companies. You cannot just, create new water.
I want to start a water company.
Yeah, I couldn't start a water company because I can't just make new water. There is water and that's it should be controlled by the state because you cannot just have competition there. Same as the railways. Why would I start a railway company? Because I can't just build new railways. And so these are natural, we would call them natural monopolies because there's no competition. Whereas monopolies in, say, mobile phones, you could say Apple has a monopoly because it sells the most phones and other companies cannot compete with them in the mobile device market.
There are other phone companies.
There are, but, would you trade your iPhone for another phone?
No, I wouldn't.
Exactly. So that's monopoly. A monopoly is basically when you only see yourself buying from one company. It then controls a monopoly. And we're all tied into Apple, and they make it that way. They make it anti-competitive. But yeah, sorry, to get back to the right then, the right would argue that in the ideal libertarian world that wouldn't happen. And you would always get competition, even though they can see that it doesn't work. And so you do have this kind of sort of strange reality where they argue that the less the government does, the better things will get. And then in reality, when that happens, the worse it gets, because you get these inefficiencies where companies just become lazy because they don't need to compete anymore because they control the market share.
And I think the idea is, yeah, well, I'm not in a big business, how does this affect me? But the point is when there is a monopoly, it's about control of the prices too, isn't it?
Yeah.
So when someone has complete domination over a industry, they can charge what they want for it. So when you're wondering why your train travel costs so much, well, there you go.
Yeah, because the privatising the railways just meant that they set the prices and there's no competition, and nobody can introduce competition because you can't just go out and build new railways.
Only one train journey from Manchester to London, isn't there?
Yeah. And so what happens in lots of cases is people just buy a car and then they just think, well, I can't pay the train fares now because they're too expensive. So then they think, well, the competition is different forms of transport. So they buy a car, which, isn't the point really, is it? We should be able to use our trains.
So to ask the same question that we did when we were talking about the left. So if communism is the most extreme form of the left spectrum, what is the most extreme form of the right?
Well, people always talk about like fascism or dictatorships as sort of like the far right, but really the furthest right is sort of this kind of anti-state, basically no state, small state, having a state that doesn't offer any welfare, doesn't offer any protections for its people, basically it is the Wild West in that whatever you can pay for, you can get, and if you can't pay for anything, well, too bad, nobody's there to protect you. And so for some people who have lots of resources, they would be fine in this kind of world because they can pay for it. It's almost like a feudal system. It's like returning to feudalism where you have lords and kings who basically take rent from everyone and they then decide the law of the land. And you almost see like this is kind of the ideal world that I think people like Elon Musk would love, where he sets the rules and he decides what's fair or not, and he decides what freedom of speech is. And this brings us on to, I think, the next interesting point is freedom in these equations here.
So I just wanted to say that while the prospect of this freedom, like you're saying, is quite appealing, but you've got to think about, if you are born just to a poor family, you are competing then against someone who's born into a rich family. And if you are unable to provide, or even you're born with some kind of disability and you cannot provide for yourself, well, then you're just kind of out of luck.
Yeah, the bigger that gap is, the more difficult. And what a centre-left, maybe like this current Labour government would say, is that we should diminish that gap so that people can achieve from different backgrounds or different economic backgrounds or different, if you have a disability, you should be able to still achieve a high position in the workplace if you are good enough at your job. Whereas in kind of this libertarian world, a lot of the time what would happen is if you are from a worse off background, you simply would be given no tools or opportunities to achieve, even though they would suggest, the market decides. How can the market decide that I could have an education if I'm from a very poor background and have no opportunities? I think for me, the most interesting thing about the left and the right is that the right is associated with free markets and anti-government regulation, but actually is also opposed to individual freedoms. So it's often opposed to freedom of gender, freedom of sexuality, and all these kind of freedoms that you would say, I want to be free to decide who I am. The right often says, no, you are who we say you are. And that's who, well,
so how do people do that? How would the right do that?
Well, for example, they would say that your gender should be the same as assigned at birth. And so if let's say I feel like I identify as a woman, the right would say, no, you that choice is closed off to you. Or if in many cases, they still argue that if I said I wanted to have a relationship with a man, Many on the far right, the hard right, would say, no, you must have a relationship with a woman because that is, for them, how the world works. And which is interesting because being so opposed to kind of regulation and government regulation and then causing
This
for the free
idea that
market.
you can live your life however you want.
Exactly. They actually say, but then the government is allowed to tell you that you can't do those, or we think the government should be allowed to tell you that, or like you can't have an abortion as well. This is a position on the right that you shouldn't be able to, women shouldn't have the freedom to decide what to do with their bodies. Whereas,
Dare I say, there's a contradiction in there somewhere.
Whereas the left are actually about sort of government regulation to protect everyone, really, or to protect the majority, yet they are completely for individual freedoms, the freedom to love who you want to love, the freedom to identify as who you want to identify
Freedom of
as.
movement.
Freedom of movement, that's an important one. The right are incredibly opposed to freedom of movement, but a freedom of movement for the majority, not for the few. That's why they love private jets. That's why they have multiple passports. They buy passports and they can go wherever they want. And this is the thing, the right are actually really for freedom for the few, whereas the left are for the freedom for the many. And so when we hear arguments about freedom, it's important to think, whose freedom are they talking about? Just like Brexit is a right-wing argument because it's about freedom for the few. It's about freedom to basically have low taxes and deregulation for the few. And the many, which is most of us, limiting our free movement throughout Europe. And we can't move freely, but they can. And so this is where we see, actually, the left is about individual freedom, but state regulation to ensure those freedoms and to protect those freedoms, whereas the right is about no state regulation to basically prevent there being something to protect our individual freedoms.
I know we've gone on for a little bit, but I think it's all interesting. And to try and put that theory into practice, let's start with the left. What left governments in history can we look at and think, that was a good example?
I think there's been quite a few, especially in the UK. You could say like the Labour governments that brought in the NHS.
That was Attlee, wasn't it?
Yeah. So you can say these kind of governments that bring in big welfare schemes are on the left because what they are doing is offering protections to the many. And you can say many of the post-World War II governments that bring about free movement in Europe, protections for workers, governments that work with trade unions, those kind of things. Whereas I think when we look at the right, we see actually that these movements are often, funnily enough, associated with religious movements. Religious conservative movements are often opposed to the state. And so in a lot of countries now, when you think of like Turkey or you think of Iran, these are governments on the right, and they're very associated to religions, the dominant religion, and they're often very intolerant to other people's religions or minority religions.
So just when we talk about governments on the right of politics, so this recent Tory government, 14 years, how would you place that on the spectrum?
Well, I would say that they are definitely on the right and that they're clearly opposed to freedom of movement. They are completely for, especially like Liz Truss, free markets, anti-government, anti-civil service.
How much money did Liz Truss cost the taxpayer?
Billions, wasn't it? I can't remember the exact amount.
Was it 30?
I think that sounds about right, yeah.
When we talk about things like public services, we've seen the NHS crumbling. Schools are literally crumbling.
Yeah, because
public transport struggling.
Yeah, the right doesn't believe that you have a right to education or healthcare. It says you must work hard enough to ensure you can pay for those things, which is kind of a difficult thing to say, especially like, if you're a working person but you get an illness, so you get cancer, or someone in your family gets cancer and you have to care for them, so if you can't work or you have to take time off work, and so you should then have to pay as well for your healthcare. These are kind of mad ideas. I do understand when people say, you should be working and contributing to society, and nobody I think would disagree with that, but you should be given some assurances by society that you can do that you can work.
And I think maybe this is a topic for another episode, but when we talk about privatisation of our public industries, I think it'd be interesting to see where the money goes, because we've had our train travel privatised, and that, I think, was contracted out to an Italian company.
And French.
And French.
German.
So all that money that, I mean, when we talk about how expensive train travel has become, that money is then not getting spent back in Britain, is it?
No. Your money, taxpayers' money, is siphoned off into... Well, sorry, no, it's not your tax money, but your money is siphoned off into private investment funds and pension funds and American hedge funds, because our government sold them off for cheap prices to earn, basically Thatcher wanted to raise a bunch of money in the 80s so that she could give tax cuts. So sold a bunch of national institutions, national infrastructure, so that these companies have for years and years ripped off British people, which, is a real tragedy.
But it is the reality.
It is the reality, yeah, that we are being ripped off. We're being ripped off for so many things, because water companies should not pay dividends. They should not be able to pay dividends out to investors. It should be controlled by the government, and the government should always be investing to ensure that our water is safe and drinkable, and that sewage isn't in our rivers. But instead, the money that should have gone in reinvesting in protecting those things has gone into the pockets of American, French, German, Japanese, all of these big hedge funds, into the pockets of their investors. And that money is supposed to be protecting our water sources. This is the one that I think captures most people's anger, because we're swimming in shitty rivers because we sold off the water companies. What? It's actually absurd if you think about it, that the money that should have gone into making sure our rivers stayed clean, we've just given it all away.
Yeah. So
you've run out of things to say. Speechless. Yeah. But I think the important thing to maybe take away from this, that really the left is about the needs of the many and the right is about the needs of the few. Because even though they will argue that the markets can decide, they will make things fair, reality shows us that this is not the case.
But at the end of the day, if the state has no power, who is going to stop water companies from polluting the rivers?
Yeah, well, it's feudalism. The state was introduced to stop the royal family exploiting us. And then what would happen is, with no state, you would simply get new forms of exploitation from what is kind of royal family-esque exploiters. People that use violence and use means of control to ensure that you pay your rent to them, and that there is nobody there to make sure that they redistribute that.
So I think we're at...
Yeah. No, I think that's a... It's good. Maybe, have you got anything positive to say this week?
It doesn't help how England didn't bring it home last night. So
no. But the
in a bit of a mood.
The positive is that we got to a final. Things are getting better. This government hasn't had any controversy in 2 weeks.
Feels like a record.
Which is like about 7 years in Tory, in terms of how many controversies there were with them. So, things are on the up.
Okay, well, thank you for listening, and we'll be back maybe next week.
Yeah.
Get a burp.